I wonder if you've ever been to a Christian conference that's so brilliant that you don't want it to end. You want to hear every word that the speaker has to say. Or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps you're raising your eyebrows at the speaker and you've only been in the room half an hour or so. What is it about a speaker or a subject that you find so captivating? Well, this morning's reading, we read that Jesus is once again surrounded by a crowd of thousands. Again, thousands of people who need sustenance. For whatever reason, Jesus tells us that they've not eaten. Perhaps they didn't expect the speaker to be so good, or expect him to be so long. But these people don't want to miss a word of what Jesus is saying. This crowd has gathered because they've heard all the good things that Jesus is doing. But how long would I sit and listen to the man who everyone is talking about? People saying that he's doing so-called miracles. How long would I want to listen to him? 2, 3, 5 or 6 hours possibly? Maybe a bit longer? Well, this crowd of thousands have been prepared to stay and listen to Jesus for 3 days. 3 days out in the middle of nowhere, and I bet they are ravenous. Any food that they've taken would have been eaten on the first day. Any crisps or sweets, they've already gone, or perhaps that's just me at a conference. Well, we read, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. Jesus is the one doing the talking and the ministering, but Jesus' concern is always for the people. But he's no pushover. Jesus is well aware of why people flock around him or follow him. Curiosity brings most of them. They want to see him in action. They want to see him healing and casting out demons. They want to see him raising the dead. Faith isn't always what they're after. But he still sees their need and he shows compassion. 3 days they've listened to Jesus. 3 days sitting in his presence, listening to Jesus. This is life-changing, isn't it? 3 days listening to Jesus. Well, yes, it definitely is life-changing, but if you are not listening, then it's not life-changing. Jesus says, they have been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but we're in this remote place. How can we get bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. Reading this was a surprise to me. Only perhaps a few weeks, 2-3 weeks ago, before this occasion, the disciples were witnesses to Jesus feeding thousands using a meagre small boy's lunch. But now we read, if I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long way. His disciples answered, but we're in this remote place. How can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. 7, they replied. Hang on. You were witness to Jesus feeding thousands with 5 minute loaves. These are not bloomers from Sainsbury's or Tesco. These are minute pieces of bread. They are smaller than our rolls or our baps. And a few tiddly fish. You have 7 loaves and a few fish. And you ask Jesus where you are going to get food from. Are they being selfish? Do they not want to share their 7 loaves? Or are they a bit dim? They were there when Jesus gave the food that God had multiplied. They were there. Why are they not seeing what is possible? Well, 1 minute we can be astounded by the miracles that Jesus does. And the next minute, they're too hard for us to believe. It may be that the minds of the disciples simply cannot comprehend that the miracle of feeding the thousands with a small amount of food can possibly be done again. But now Jesus gets back in the boat and moves to Dalmanutha. And guess what? Yeah, the Pharisees, they're like a bad penny. They are waiting for Jesus. They're here again. And they're ready to pounce. They ask him for proof. Just a simple sign from heaven to prove who he is. If he wasn't already God, I'm sure he would rub his temples and say, "Good Lord, not you again." We can hear the frustration as he speaks, his sigh of exasperation. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus, to test him. They asked for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply. And he said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Are they taking the mick? How many signs, how many miracles does Jesus need to do to prove who he is? One more sign isn't going to change their attitude or their belief in him. Their attitude towards Jesus stinks. They know what they're doing. They're acting stupid, but they're not. They simply hate him. They say that they want a sign from heaven to authenticate his miracles, but Jesus doesn't fall for it. If you can't see what is right in front of your eyes, I'm not going to give you any more help. I wonder if you've ever been asked to prove that there is a God. I've been asked a few times. My response to the question is, I say, you have as much proof as I do of God's existence. Because the proof is all around us. And his book, the Bible, tells us everything we need to know about who Jesus is, who God is. But people choose not to believe, don't they? Because they don't want to believe. Jesus can give sign after sign after sign, but nothing will change the hardened hearts of people, especially the Pharisees. Jesus has given them all the evidence they need to prove who he says he is. God. Why should he give more? What else can he give? His life. Jesus doesn't stay in the Jewish territory for long. He knows where he's not wanted. So back in the boat, he starts a conversation. Be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Of course, the disciples think that Jesus is telling them off for forgetting the bread. Haven't they learned? Haven't they learned that if Jesus wants bread, Jesus will have bread? But it's not about the loaves of bread. Be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So what is it that the Pharisees and Herod have in common? Well, when Jesus was brought to Herod, in chains, Herod was delighted to see him. He thought that Jesus would do some tricks. He thought that he would do some signs. He thought that he would get to know Jesus by talking with Jesus. But he's actually not interested. He, along with the Pharisees, they're asking the same thing. They want a dramatic show. You can see the headlines, can't you? Oh yay! Oh yay! Oh yay! The Pharisees and Jesus have witnessed the miracles. The Pharisees and Herod have witnessed the miracles of Jesus. Then they will have faith. Yeah, that's how it works, isn't it? Not. It's not seeing Jesus' miracles that give us faith. And Jesus warns his disciples to be aware of this attitude. Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do your eyes fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? Rather than focusing on the bread, the disciples need to focus beyond the miracle. What is the bread symbolizing? What is the feeding of thousands symbolizing? They're so concerned with the bread that they miss the bread. Jesus doesn't blame the crowds for not bringing food. But he wants the disciples to have the confidence in him to be able to feed the thousands with only a few crumbs of bread, or with no crumbs. You have 20/20 vision, and yet you cannot see. Your ears seem to be working perfectly, yet you cannot hear. All that you've witnessed, the miracles, the food, the teaching, yet you've not worked out who you are walking with. So what's his message for us today? Jesus had compassion on the crowds and saw their needs. And he still has compassion on the people, and he still sees our needs. But don't take that as he will give you what you want, because he won't. But he will give you what you need. And what's that? I suppose some may ask. Well, it's the bread. Jesus will happily give you the bread. He came to distribute himself, and he continues to distribute himself today. We have 2 accounts of feeding thousands. One group are Jews and the other are Gentiles. Jesus says, I come for every nation. But are you hungry? Do you know that there is no other food that can satisfy us more than the living bread? Do you know that you are running on empty? Your life is pointless. Nothing other than Jesus can satisfy our greatest needs. A question for you, and it applies to me also. Are you like the disciples sometimes? Do you miss what's right under your nose? Because Christians can do that, you know. How many times do we have to be reassured of the promises of Jesus before we will really trust him? How many times do we need to be told that he will never leave us before we are confident of this truth? When will we believe that he is working out his good purposes for those in his life? But if you're not a Christian, how many times do you need to hear this message? When will we open our eyes and our ears to know that Jesus is who he says he is? God. So why are we told again that Jesus fed thousands with food that is obviously not enough in our eye? Where does this feeding take us? Well, this bread fed these people for a short time until they would get home and feed again. Jesus says, if you eat of him who is the bread of life, you will never need to eat again. Physically, yes. Spiritually, no. Jesus is enough. He is our promised Saviour. He came to give himself. Jesus is the bread of life. And he laid down his life so that we may have life. But this comes with a warning. Jesus turned his back and walked away from those who made demands on him. They were unwilling to hear the truth. Please do not be the person who ignores his daily miracles. Please do not be the person who cannot hear his voice. Because that is the time when you really need to start worrying. Amen.